David Morgan.
And I'm Bill Tillman.
Welcome to Everyday Ethics. In today's episode of Everyday Ethics, we're going to be talking about courage, the last of a trilogy of overarching values that we've discussed in the past several episodes. Values of accountability, forgiveness, and then today, courage. A quick review of these reminds how relevant these are in our everyday lives. We live, at least those of us in the United States, in a fragmented, polarized, chaotic world where sweeping and extensive response is to dodge responsibility. We share blame. We retaliate. We seek revenge. Instead, perhaps accepting mutual accountability may, can, ought to help us to reach a point where we can accept responsibility for our own actions. Accepting responsibility for our own actions might lead us to the point where we learn how to forgive others and how to accept forgiveness from others. And yet, despite the need for accountability, despite the obvious lack of forgiveness in our world today, attacks on the vulnerable in our neighborhoods continue, persist, and even increase. But communities seem to be more resistant to these attacks than in past times. They seem to be reclaiming notions of justice, often led by clergy who demonstrate with boldness and indeed with courage. Well, we're going to be discussing courage in detail in just a few moments. Bill, but before we get into the specific conversation on courage, can you share with us some perhaps reasons or that you put accountability, forgiveness, and courage together, why you chose these three among all values for our conversations in your book?
Well, after a time, during my years of doing classroom work, writing, and out and about speaking, I began to see that these matters of justice, mercy, that's how accountability and forgiveness are treated in the Bible, had too often been kept separate. But frankly, I began to see that these kind of things, they shouldn't be kept in compartments, but really did fit together. Some of that was probably more plain to me looking at Old Testament statements where the concepts of justice and love preceded and or followed each other in the conversations, the narratives that were in there. So that was one point. Those things are about real life. And that's where the biblical writers were composing those accounts. And then with the matter of courage, that developed as a separate concept in my early work in decision making. And that's an area of Christian ethics. Mm-hmm. But taking note that any of the engagements that we do, any application of the values that we hold, that takes some courage to do. And there it began to fall into place that these things really are part and parcel of each other. That the way life comes at us, the way we experience life, we may have the impact of needing to be courageous about some matter, and it's possibly around the matter of justice, of accountability. And I would add, this accountability idea, it is part of the universe. There is accountability in the first couple of chapters of Genesis, where there are relationships set up between God and humans, being essentially co-creators, stewards over the creation. And then the matter of forgiveness is there as well. On the humans broke down on their accountability, but there was the rebuilding of the relationship from God for the people to keep on going. That took some courage. So just about any point that you begin with this, these things are interdependent, like the other items that we've talked about in another triad, for instance.
Okay. Oh, and you mentioned relationships, you mentioned courage, and we're recording this on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be traveling down to be with family tomorrow. And as I was thinking about what we might say, I remembered not too many years ago at an introduction to a sermon, I was giving some semi-serious, lighthearted advice on Thanksgiving conversations. I said, here are things you do not talk about at Thanksgiving dinner. You do not talk about politics. You do not talk about religion. And above all, you do not talk about who has the best superhero comics, DC or Marvel. It got chuckles then as well. And periodically, even as I'm teaching today, it will come up when I allow students to pick a superhero they'd like to have dinner with. There will be with today's generation, more often than not, they choose a Marvel character as one of the people they would like to have dinner with. And you begin to think about some of these heroes, both DC and Marvel, and some of these folks are a bit flawed. They're complex at the very least. And in your book, you mentioned we talk about those of courageous, and sometimes we begin to think about the judges in the Old Testament, in the book of Judges.
Yeah.
And we just begin to wonder just exactly, are those the kind of examples we should be following? And I hesitate sometimes to list some of those folks as the kind of models we ought to be looking at.
Yeah.
But yet at the same time, as we are discussing biblical ethics in part of our conversations, I was thinking about a character that we might look at to use as a model or an example for comments that we want to make about living courageous lives in our everyday lives. And Jeremiah came to mind. Jeremiah is known as a reluctant prophet, a weeping prophet. He is known for his confessions of maybe saying, God, if you could find someone else, I'm okay with that. And I think the fact that seems to be a significant amount of hesitancy to be a prophet and chagrin over being a prophet, that we might use him as an example, because he's not some ideal person that built on a pedestal that could easily crumble. I mean, he is not on a pedestal as many would consider a courageous person. So your thoughts?
Well, that's a good example that too often when this idea of courage comes up in heroes and heroines. Those kind of examples are used, that people are painted to be bigger than life. And that would be the case with the judges.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would add, and this would be one way to read scripture, is to think of these pieces, these books that we have, these narratives. They are stories of heroes and heroines. And you can find other examples besides Jeremiah that are rather reluctant about getting into the job that is laid out in front of them. But with Jeremiah, we've got a lot of details on how he tried to carry on conversation with the religious leaders of his time,
Mhm.
who essentially missed on all of this political military dynamic that was going on in that part of the world. And at the least, you'd have to say he was quite insightful in being able to read the tea leaves, so to speak. But also finding points where he could at least establish some resonance with other people. I do think we need to put in here somewhere the basic idea of courage. It might help a little bit. Courage is one of those words that has come out of Latin through the Romance languages and lands in English with basically the same meanings that it started with. And in French, which is one of the closer bases for our English word, it's coeur, and essentially means heart. And we may have heard people say, I don't have the heart to do that. So another sense would be, I don't have the energy, I don't have the conviction, I don't have the strength, I don't have the will to do it. And there begins to be one of the demarcations, I think. And back to somebody like Jeremiah, he ran into some very difficult circumstances, thrown down into a well, and people can find that episode. He offered the predictions of what was going to happen with the invasion and had to stay there and watch it. He did not get out of it. And that exhibits some courage to stay with the people facing whatever comes. So, Jeremiah, good example.
Okay. Well, you commented how he, was listening to the folks around him, knew what was going on. You didn't mention, and I think this was something that we could point out too, that even after some had been deported,
Yeah,
he heard this differing statement from some of the leaders saying, this is going to be over in a year, 2 years, you'll be back home.
yeah.
At which time
Yeah.
he be as in listening to them, and I think probably listening to some of the exiles as well, who were anxious to return, fearful,
Yeah,
anxious about what was going on. He wrote the letter to them, basically encouraging them to say,
yeah,
you're going to
yeah.
be there a while.
Oh, yeah,
Have the will, have
yeah,
the heart to build houses, to really just to realize for the next 70 years at least, you're going to be here, live as you would have lived back home. Seek
yeah,
the good for yourself, seek the good for your
yeah,
community. But and that idea of listening and having the courage to say to them, okay, you're in this for the long haul, not a popular statement,
right,
but then
right,
providing them a hope and an encouragement, to use that term with courage in it, to
right.
hang in
Yeah,
there until they did indeed return from exile as well. Which I mentioned some of those folks. I think Shemaiah was one of those who basically said, we need to get rid of Jeremiah.
oh, yeah,
And
yeah,
Jeremiah's response was, well, that's because you're not a true prophet. And 70 years later, Shemaiah, they were fully aware Jeremiah was indeed the real
yeah,
prophet with all of that. But Jeremiah was ridiculed by
yeah,
his own family. I mean, it's like they were, I mean, they were plotting to execute, to kill their own kin.
Yeah.
Hananiah ridiculed him when he showed up with the wooden yoke and said, "We're going to be yoked in exile," and everything that went along with that. The kings ridiculed him, made fun of him, imprisoned him. And despite all of that, he was able to just, I mean, just continue doing what he was doing. And I don't think to me, it wasn't in a heroic fashion, as we have mentioned, but
Yeah.
it was like each day, this is what I'm doing for today. And then tomorrow we'll deal with it and express that same kind of courage without being overwhelmed by the opposition.
Yeah, right. So good example. And back to my point, this is one way to read scripture. Look for the heroes and heroines and how they met the circumstances that they were in. And you had at one time mentioned, and we typically have not done it in these segments, but referenced the discussion questions at the end of each of the chapters of the book, the triadic approach. But there is one question at the end of this chapter that is the basis for this part of our conversation, of other biblical examples. And if you follow up on that, of course, the names like Moses, Joshua, David, those will pop up. And each one of them, interestingly enough, and I would add Isaiah, that prophet, they got this basic line, be strong and courageous, for I am with you, and the I being Jehovah God. And that ran over then from Moses to Isaiah some hundreds of years. My guess is that was a part of Hebrew theology. Certainly it was an address of God and intended to be heard as coming from God. But this be strong idea, it also can be translated do not fear. Of course, that comes through, and you probably delivered the sermons and other people have around, see, this next Sunday, we're beginning Advent. And here is the birth of Jesus on the horizon. And so many of those conversations of the announcements by the angels began with, do not be afraid. And the opposite of fear could be courage.
Right.
Now, I don't think it's ever implied you will have no fear. It's back like our discussion last time on forgiveness and Lewis Smead's point of forgive and forget. We really never will forget.
Right.
We never will be completely without fear. And that comes up in these narratives. Looking at each of those characters, I mean, in David's Psalms, he relates the circumstances. He's being trailed by Saul, outcast, all of that. There was real fear for his life, but kept moving, kept moving, kept moving. And I think what you just alluded to with Jeremiah is a good example. You keep putting one foot in front of the other. And reading your context. And we'll get to this later, I think, as we talk about some more ideas of describing courage, but knowing when to take the steps. That's one of the matters. So insight in that regard.
Mhm. Well, I want to talk about several of the other ones you mentioned, but I want to move it just away perhaps from Jeremiah a bit, because I think we have an example in our nation in recent weeks of several of these other descriptions that we have of courage. Being courageous isn't necessarily being prophetic, which sometimes I feel that people misequate prophetic with being stubborn, arrogant. I mean, in the book, you put there's an approach of demonizing the other and lionizing one's own approach.
Yeah.
And we have talked from the beginning of this podcast that we're series that we want to move away from the demonizing and lionizing because, as you said later on, there is not necessarily any one right or wrong. We've talked about moral absolutes, moral relativism, and those of us who want to be prophetic and stand up front, we tend to move into some moral absolutism, and I've tried that myself on occasions and have realized in listening to others when the time did come around that maybe being prophetic was just, and being courageous was just realizing that taking the time to listen, taking the time and not to demonize, but to say, let's work together.
Yeah.
Because one of the other things you said in your book was being courageous doesn't always look like winning as the cultural pictures of win. We've talked about this, you and I, in recent days, and I've had conversations with others about the ending of the government shutdown earlier this month. And 8 Democrats decided they wanted to end the shutdown.
Yeah.
Worked out an agreement with the Republicans in the Senate, and the government was reopened as a result of about what I would say is the courage of these 8.
Yeah.
But these 8 were demonized by others, and then they were lionized by and just extolled by others who think these people finally stood up and said, no, this has to end.
Yeah.
And yet, and then we've talked about, I don't think what they did, some in their own party think we didn't win, we lost this. But yet at the same time, I'm not certain that they didn't realize that a courageous act at this point would be saying there is no way to win at this time, as we had pictured winning and losing at that moment. And they basically said the courageous thing to do is to let this move on, and you put shake the dust off our feet, move forward, and if we need to, address this issue at another time. I mean, they and that they were considered, they wimped out at the last minute instead of being bold and courageous and being steadfast. I'm thinking they did a courageous thing by bucking what others were saying at that time and getting the government reopened again.
Yeah. Well, I think that reference point that you made out of the book chapter, somewhere around one of the subheads I used was proportionality and timing. And I think those are important qualities wherever we apply those ideas in our decisions. That it was, well, back to Henley Barnett, one of his ideas about studying Christian ethics was we study Christian ethics so as to keep in proportion things that are minor issues and not allow them to be stated as major issues. Well, that takes some thinking about it. And it takes some willingness to listen to other parties. The timing idea, there's, well, you know, that famous passage in Ecclesiastes, a time to do this, a time to do that. And it just walks around the realms of life. And the basic thought in there is we've got to read the context and know the people, or try to know the people before we act, because so many of these things come off haphazardly. And this matter of, you know, I would suggest try not to sound prophetic. Because there are cliches that have come around that. One of them is, and I hear this from pulpits, from those that, you know, we got to make some change with things. Speak truth to power. Like, that's the end all of it, and the rest of you not doing that, well, you must be cowards. Well, it's back to the point that you just made, though. Speaking truth to power, well, where is this truth? How much of it do we actually have hold of it? And my experience of life is the perspectives about truth comes from a wide circle. That whatever the conflict matter is going on around the table, for instance, there are proportions of truth in each, dare I say, argument, each perspective. The real courage is, okay, can we figure out a way to put these things together and come out with the most good for the most people? That's where real life is. Another cliche that we get into, just much like that one, is silence is complicity. Again, timing and proportionality. It's going to be a rare individual that has not found her or himself in a situation where to say anything. It's going to be a dangerous happening. And that matters at hand that are quite serious are not going to happen if I don't stay quiet. And I think these things need to be thought of along a continuum. You can be too quiet.
Right.
And you know, and there we're back to Jeremiah. There were times he would use the title, the label, the reluctant prophet. There were times he just wanted to step out of all of that. And then along the continuum is those people who find it necessary. And some of the most valuable perspectives often come from those that you least expect to hear this concept come across for everybody, put it all together. Now, in my role that I had a lot of years ago, I got to work with Albert McClellan, now long deceased. He was the associate executive director in this denominational framework. Was the one that set in on all of the committee meetings, the board meetings. And I've been in there with him and learned there are places to sit around a conference table that do have more power of visibility than other places. And I've also watched conversations go on and on and on, and Albert never said a word. And then finally, it's almost like everybody in the room sort of got exhausted. And they turned to Albert, well, Dr. McClellan, what would you think? And he would take all of this almost chaos of concepts and ideas and put them together. And there it was.
Mm.
Herb Reynolds, former president at Baylor University. I watched him do the same kind of thing. Uh, it is a gift, a skill, I think, developed. But those people, we can learn mechanisms from watching them. Because in both those characters, proportionality and timing were at work.
Well, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least touch a bit on the New Testament.
Sure.
And I know I used the word encourage today, and it dawned on me then that was a word that Paul used.
He did.
Uh,
Um, and several times, literally that term. But then, and here's another comment, read, and it won't take that long, but sit down and read the letters attributed to the Apostle Paul. And those are all directed to congregations or the leadership of their congregation, like Timothy or Titus, for example. But throughout is always advice, mentoring, education, of the expectations upon those people who claim Christianity to be their life faith and guiding value system. But he would use terms like live in harmony with one another, stand firm, rejoice together. I mean, it was always community related, but as you read those passages, you'll see that the movement is, I'm encouraging you. And to the Galatians, it's one of my favorite places that illustrates this idea, is encourage one another. One begins to fall, help them carry that burden. And the image is that of another person is trying to carry a heavy boulder and is nearly falling under it, but other friends come in and lend a shoulder, get under the boulder with them. So support others. And that's encouragement. It's interesting. Where did he learn that from, Paul? Well, the guy that pulled him in to that early band of disciples was Barnabas. And his name translates to son of encouragement. It just, you can't make this stuff up. But there are enough of those instances from Paul. That is basically, and I've got another little book called The Patterns of Paul, or Pauline Patterns, because there is the repetition of these kinds of ideas, like encouraging one another throughout his letters. And you can see, in fact, some growth, some deepening of these ideas. So he wasn't static. However, he was working this out at the beginning of his apostleship, but education going on, experiencing the encouragement with one another. And some of these letters, they're just endearing as he remembers being with these people and the good memories. Well, we have known people like that because we are around them, we feel like we can take some more steps forward. We can be a little fuller with what we're doing.
Mhm. I thought it was interesting you mentioned Galatians,
Ah.
his harshest letter. And yet in the last few verses of that, he says, let us not lose heart in
And
doing
there it
good.
is. There it is. You got it.
Do not lose heart.
That's
And
another way of saying be encouraged,
totally.
have courage. Now it's not easy a lot of days. And now we're back to Jeremiah. I think he's a good picture of reality. That there are, are there more difficult days and difficult decisions to make than those good, peaceful days? Well, it depends on who you talk to.
Mhm.
But the cultural context we're in now, David, it is a rare individual that I've come across who is not in some state of despair.
Right.
They're not depressed, but they may say, oh, these are hard times. I have never seen anything like this before. And they're talking about politics, they're talking about the economy, they're also talking about their life in congregational life too.
Mhm.
That's not unusual, but that's too bad.
It is. And people I run across sound the same. And it's a struggle that we're facing. And today I hope that we've shared some things with the folks that will help
Yeah.
them display courageous qualities. I mean, yeah, we've looked at Jeremiah. We have looked at Albert McClellan, Herb Reynolds. I mean, we didn't mention T.B. Maston, but T.B. Maston could fit into this as a courageous person. We've seen,
We'll be doing that, I'm
we
sure.
will do that. We've seen how Paul inspired folks, encouraged folks by his own example. And yet, even though I think we need to be reminded and to remind others that it's not just famous or the heroic that act courageously,
Yeah.
but courage can show up in the everyday lives of ordinary people. You, me, those who listen, ordinary people who face numerous opportunities each day to display and demonstrate courage in their own lives. And actually, we've not even hardly mentioned Jesus today. But yeah, and we've had plenty of examples elsewhere, but Jesus taught his disciples to not be afraid. He reminded them, that God knew the number of hairs on their head. They could be strong because they knew that God was with them. Jesus informed the women at the tomb as he said, go and tell my disciples that they too were to not be afraid, to not fear. I mean, and there are other examples that I could give. Time's not going to allow it, but Jesus taught, lived, and embodied courage. And so as we go today, choose courage and walk as Jesus walked. Thank you.
Everyday Ethics is brought to you by the T.B. Maston Foundation, which seeks to proclaim the abiding relevance of the whole gospel of Jesus Christ and provide support for the study and application of Christian ethics. For more information or to donate, visit tbmaston.org.